Hello, many thanks for joining us. You're watching Addis News Hour with the news. I'm Tabitha John. Do stay with us. But first, we have a breaking news. Ethiopian allied forces led by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed have freed several towns and areas in battles at 3 fronts. According to a statement by the Ethiopian Ministry of Government Communication Services, the allied forces are causing massive destructions to the TPLF army. Accordingly, Ozuba and Chila towns have been freed through a battle at Gashana front, while Majete, Kamise, Riken, Weledi and Albuko towns have been freed in the fight at Kamise front. Other 3 towns along the Warreilu front have also been freed. The allied forces are advancing to the strategic towns of Waldia, Kombolcha and Desi, it was learned. Thousands of soldiers of the terrorist TPLF group are surrendering to the National Army in response to the call made by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed so far. Remarkable victories are being registered since the Commander-in-Chief and Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed started leading the military offensive from the front line under the theme Campaign for Multinational Unity. The joint forces under the leadership of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed have liberated several towns and key places, including Gashana, Shawa, Warreilu, Chafra, and others from occupation of the terrorist group TPLF soldiers. Captives said they have been forced to surrender because the terrorist TPLF is facing complete defeat at all fronts, calling others to shun the ongoing disinformation by the criminal group and peacefully surrender. The captives said that they have joined the war because their families were forced by the ringleaders of the junta to let them to march alongside the criminal group forces. TPLF has massacred at least 400 civilians at a single town called Gashana in Amhara state, locals told ETV. Residents say the terrorist group raped women, looted and destroyed property, and committed serious human rights abuses in the area. Kasahun Chani has the detail.
This, what you observe, is a place called Gashana St. Michael Church, where these people have felt their deepest sadness over the deaths of 16 innocent civilians killed by the terrorist TPLF in a home. Families of the victims told ETV that TPLF terrorist group killed them, suspecting them of leading the Amhara Special Force to the TPLF foxholes.
They killed 16 of our families at a time in one home. My son didn't stay at home for at least a week. His mother didn't see him. They didn't see each other for too long. All the 16 people were massacred in one home. This atrocity committed by the TPLF terrorist group has never been seen even across the globe. Women were raped, the youths were killed, and the elderly were brutally murdered. Right now, you are observing various funerals, but if you have come earlier, you would have witnessed too many dead bodies before burial.
On the day TV reporter covered this story, he witnessed the funeral of over 40 bodies killed.
If you go to Kabale 19 only, you will hear the massacre of at least 13 civilians. TPLF brutally killed the resident's son and father, husband and wife, and mother and daughter. If you sum up the number of deaths in all Kabales here, It could be above 400 people without any addition. It was a whole very horrific murder.
The TPLF terrorist group, which occupied the city of Gashana, has completely looted private and public institutions and businesses in the city and destroyed those properties that cannot be taken to Tigray.
China strongly denounces undue foreign interventions into the internal affairs of Ethiopia. Briefing journalists on Friday, Ambassador of China to Ethiopia, Zhao Zhiyuan, said China is against any pressure against African countries under the guise of democracy and human rights protection. The ambassador underscored that the recent China-Africa summit held in Senegal, Dakar, is a testament for the strong will forged between China and Africa for a multifaceted relations in the years to come. Jerusalem Betzaha has more.
A message of solidarity to the people and government of Ethiopia is pouring in from different directions as the US and its allies are mounting pressure on the East African nation under the guise of humanitarian concerns. From joining the #NoMore movement to boldly opposing the position of the US and its allies, China takes the lead to say no to foreign interference into the internal affairs of developing nations.
China firmly supports Ethiopia's efforts to safeguard sovereignty and independence, and believes that the Ethiopian government has the ability and wisdom to manage the country's internal affairs. China will continue to support the Ethiopian people as they work for peace, stability, development, and prosperity. No matter how the situation are evolving, China will steadfastly stand with the Ethiopian people and keep to the consistent position of opposing external intervention in Ethiopia's internal affairs with the disguise of human rights of democracy. China's active participation in the recent No More campaign also gives strong support to Ethiopia.
Briefing journalists on Friday, Ambassador of China to Ethiopia reaffirmed his country's commitment to stand by Ethiopia to come out of the situation stronger.
Democracy is not a patent held by a certain country. This is more than one form of democracy and more than one path to realize democracy. No country has the right to monopolize the definition and the judgment of democracy, or claim itself to be the beacon of democracy. The so-called Summit for Democracy is just another attempt to cement division and impose judgment on others. It goes against the trend of the times and ends with no support.
The ambassador noted that China will reinforce its trade and economic ties with Africa for a mutually hopeful future for the two parties.
China will encourage its businesses to invest no less than $10 billion in Africa in the next 3 years, and will establish a platform for China-Africa private investment promotion. China will provide credit facilities and trade finance to African financial institutions and exporters.
In the recently held China-Africa Summit First, Dakar, Senegal, China introduced a new trade pact that allows African countries export agricultural products to China's market free of tax.
يتبو يتماو أي تفهم كلبي
The Ethiopian government's communication services criticized some Western media outlets for continually misinforming the global community about the situation in Ethiopia. The TPLF and the U.S. officials are aggressively working with these media outlets for the same cause. Habtamu Ashagwe told you more.
For both the US and Ethiopia, this relationship matters, but for almost a year now,
some Western media outlets are working in alliance with TPLF mafias to broadcast false narratives about genocidal crimes and the use of rape and starvation as weapons of war. Evidently, CNN also has a hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil policy when it comes to atrocities committed by the TPLF in various parts of the country. Jonas Buru, former deputy global manager of the International Comparison Program at the World Bank, reflected with commentary on Burkina online magazine that the laxity of CNN's adherence to strict code of journalistic conduct and lack of impartiality in its coverage of Ethiopia's war cannot be reviewed in isolation. Regarding the recent political turmoil across the country, the government of Ethiopia has repeatedly expressing the journalistic approach as well as ethics of media have been violated by some foreign media outlets. According to the government, some foreign media outlets are disseminating fake reports and broadcasting wrong narratives against government's position.
በጣም አሰቃቂ የሆኑ ጥፋቶች በአማራና በአፋር ክልሎች ህዝቦች ላይ እየደረሱ እንደሆነ ይታወቃል። ይሄንን ግን እነዚህ መገናኛ ብዙሃት ሲዘግቡት አንመለከትም።
It's obvious that the TPLF has been committing atrocities in the state of Amhara and Afar, but no single foreign media outlet has reported these atrocities in these areas. These foreign media outlets are not desirous and ready to listen to such kind of agonies. Furthermore, they have been calculative than ethical and have been running to achieve their own agenda than reporting the reality on the ground. Despite all this bias and misinformation from this media, the government is compelling evidence to show the world the mass killings of innocent civilians, gang rapes, war crimes, as well as other devilish acts of the terrorist group.
BBC's recent false news under a disinformation headline entitled Ethiopia closes schools to boost civil war efforts was the latest act of by the Global West Media campaign against Ethiopia. The objective of the temporary closure of school in the country, according to the country's Ministry of Education, is to help farmers with crop harvest. Sadly, watching CNN's reporters on the current conflict in Ethiopia is witnessing a gross violation of basic journalistic code of conduct. The misinformation has reached the highest level of some US officials expressed war crimes in Tigray by quoting CNN's report, but all CNN's report contradicts with the recent UN's report that stressed there is no evidence to support a genocidal crime. Some scholars approached by ETV English contend that these media are creating psychological war on Ethiopia and Africa. In addition, both the TPLF and the US officials are aggressively working with these media outlets for the same cause.
Money plus minority issues, minority attention, they make them convinced and they try to reflect their crying against the Ethiopian state. So I think Martin Plaut, Alex Doal, and other journalists and the so-called scholars working by money and other benefits. So they get benefit from TPLF and then they cry based on that.
TPLF had committed several human rights violations, committed atrocities against the entire population of Ethiopia, the entire Ethiopian population, but it went beyond that. It served as the bulwark of the Western powers in their doing their dirty jobs in Somalia, for example, and in South Sudan. destabilizing these countries and doing their dirty job.
Spokesman for the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, the Ethiopian politician, also an advisor to the acting president of the Tigray region.
It's also exactly 1 month since CNN lied to the global community, claiming Addis Ababa was under siege.
Welcome back. Ethiopians and Americans should demand integrity and transparency from the State Department regarding their decisions on Ethiopia. Meanwhile, Twitter and other global media platforms should not resort to silencing Ethiopians' free speech and truth, as they cannot be stopped by unanimously embarking upon. The vice chair of the Colorado Republican Party, Priscilla Rahn, made these remarks in her exclusive interview with ETV English. Shifarao Lago reports.
Priscilla Rahn is the vice chair of the Colorado Republican Party. She's the first African Korean American elected to this statewide executive board. ETV approached her for her views about U.S. policy on Africa and other current issues unfolding in Ethiopia. She started her views underscoring the fact that the Biden administration needs to revise its misguided policy toward Africa.
Well, some of my observations is that Africa has not been a high priority for the USA, and updates to our policies have to be sped up. It's been way too slow, in my opinion. We have a new administration that's less than a year old, and so there's an opportunity here for our policies towards Africa to be updated. We need to take a fresh look at our relationship with African countries, because there are new challenges for us to consider. But the solution can't be for the U.S. to dictate to Africa what your priorities should be. Most Africans reject infringement on their basic human rights, and they are concerned that America's approach to Africa is over-militarized. So Africans are capable of deciding what their priorities should be, and America must listen. And we can start by engaging more with Africa as a participant on the global stage, instead of viewing Africa like a charity or with a deficit mindset.
A small number of people from the State Department cliques are being accused of undermining the democratically elected government in Ethiopia, clearly supporting the TPLF, which is creating havoc and terrorism. She says Ethiopians and Americans need to demand integrity and transparency from the State Department.
Well, this is definitely some information that I have heard. I can appreciate that Ethiopians are very uneasy about what is happening. I would encourage Americans to contact their legislators and demand integrity and transparency from the State Department. I would also encourage Ethiopians to voice their grievance with the American embassy and lodge a complaint against any bad policies, but this is definitely an issue that should be investigated.
Twitters and other global media platforms should not resort to silencing Ethiopians' free speech and the truth, she also said, adding that they can't block the movement Ethiopians have unanimously embarked upon.
I know this is a big issue in the US, as many people feel like their voices have been canceled simply because they have a viewpoint that is not a popular opinion. There are lawsuits against Twitter and other social media platforms in the United States for silencing free speech. In fairness, if you want to get your message out to the masses, everyone needs to be sure that they're not violating any policies with their posts. The conflict in Ethiopia is very serious, and people need to make sure that they are not guilty of crossing a line with what they're saying, as they're simply telling the truth. So when social media platforms started deleting accounts, more conservative alternative platforms were created. There are other options out there to get information out, but one thing is for sure, you cannot block this movement that the Ethiopian people are engaged in.
An African American and Korean American with a multilingual, multicultural background, Priscilla Rahn says she's determined to shore up the causes of many minorities living in the United States of America.
No More movement-led rallies in several cities of Germany denounced meddling of Western powers in Ethiopia's internal affairs. In a demonstration held outside the German Chancellery, Ethiopians, people of Ethiopian descent, Eritreans and friends of Ethiopians called on the West to stop meddling in Ethiopia's internal affairs. Demonstrators in Bonn City also urged the Deutsche Welle media to stop orchestrating biased and distorted news reports against Ethiopia. Frankfurt witnessed a gathering of demonstrators at Hautfriedhof Square, where Ethiopians, people of Ethiopian descent and Eritreans denounced Western interference in Ethiopia's domestic issues. Demonstrators in the city gathered outside the embassy of the US and called on the country to stop pressuring Ethiopia. No More has appeared to be a viral trending in line with protests against interference of the West in Ethiopia and the continent Africa at large. Ethiopian US-based political analyst says America is intent to snatch the right of Ethiopians by failing Abiy Ahmed's government. He also explains US and some Western governments' lust for the Horn of Africa region, particularly Ethiopia, is because of its resource advantages. Santayo Tamrat tells us more.
NASA scientist Engineer Katao Jigo is a political and historical philosopher. Talking to Obian Horn of Africa, he says the US is intent to snatch the right of the Ethiopian people as they try to weaken Ethiopian government.
The US intervention is to weaken the government in order to take away the right of the Ethiopian people. So we need to make sure that we make it very clear, both by our voice and frankly by our will, which includes military fight back, that doesn't happen. We need to defend Ethiopia on all fronts, and we need to push Prime Minister Abiy to do the same. There's no negotiation here. We either save Ethiopia completely and keep the government intact as a result, and then we continue making reforms. We make a better, more democratic Ethiopia, which is the best Ethiopian party in history and the best African representation of Black dignity in all time.
The coalition of the African nations in the fight against the current US imperialism on Ethiopia and the Horn region is important, Binyam underscored.
It's very good to see Eritrea, Somalia, and Ethiopia. And if you haven't caught it, even Djibouti is now joining in the struggle. This is important. This is important. So the more that we join together, the more we fix those sellouts, those loose threads. The more that Eritrea, the more that Ethiopia, the more that Somalia, the more that Djibouti work together, it's very easy to eliminate all of these, whether internal enemies or external enemies.
Binyam also describes the very act of US and other Westerners on Africa as neo-colonialism fashioned to exploit the resources of wealthy African states.
Africa is very wealthy in resource and in people, and neo-colonialism is all about figuring out how to weaken wealthy African nations in order to get those resources for cheap.
In addition, US and some Western governments' desire for hegemony over the Horn region, particularly Ethiopia, is because of its resource advantages.
And my father himself gave lots of lectures about the resources of Ethiopia in particular and Africa in general. And the reason why Western governments, particularly the United States, want to intervene and cause mayhem in places like the Horn of Africa is because it's strategic militarily, but also there's resources. There's oil in the Ogaden. There's probably oil off the coast of Somalia, right? We obviously have gold. We obviously have diamond. We also obviously have all kinds of resources. So a weakened Ethiopian state also makes a weakened Horn of Africa, which makes it easy for outside influences through corporations, through governments, to exploit African nations, Ethiopia in particular, and it means they get access to the resources cheap.
Many in the African continent and in the various networks of black people globally, as well as friends of Ethiopia, are voicing their concern against US and some other Western governments' act of neocolonialism on Africa and particularly Ethiopia.
I am now joined by Dr. Antene Tsagay from Addis Ababa University School of Journalism to react on the disinformation and misinformation by some Western media. Thank you, Dr. Antene, for joining ETV English.
Thank you very much.
So the Ethiopian government is accusing some Western media outlets for showing persistence in misinforming and disinforming the global community about the situation in Ethiopia. What is your reaction to this?
In the first place, the most important point is we are not accusing them. They are accusing Ethiopia. They are mischaracterizing and at the same time informing something which is not actually Ethiopian. The reality about Ethiopia is we are people, we are country, and at the same time, we are not doing anything wrong, but we are giving a bad picture about this country. And we don't have something against them, but they are doing against us. In one or the other way, we have to clearly declare and tell them that they should know us. They don't know us. The Western media, in one way or the other, they are always going against us. That is not the picture that we have. And I think as Ethiopians and the government of Ethiopia today, we are reacting. I think it should have been in the way that we should be pictured. But the whole story, the whole picturing about Ethiopia is not the reality. It is not totally picturing us.
Okay.
So I think the Western has to know, in one way or the other, Ethiopia is not going against anyone.
Indeed.
But they are always going against us.
So in your opinion, why are these media blaming Ethiopia and sympathizing with the TPLF?
It's quite clear. In the first place, how on earth they portray Ethiopia in the wrong way, plus at the same time, how could on earth they cite a terrorist group? They are talking about democracy, they are talking about humanitarian, they are talking about genocide, whatever. The point is, how on earth, in one way or the other, cite a terrorist group?
So, can we say that their action is media imperialism by the US and its allies on Ethiopia? Can we term it that way?
Yes, it is like that. You see, the point is, if there is a legitimate government that they don't accept, they don't side with, and how on earth at the same time they all, Western media and Western governments, decline to accept the legitimacy of a government. And they talk about terrorism, they talk about this is a terrorist group. If we take, for example, the Afghanistan or the other countries, they say this group is a terrorist, that group is a Democrat. If they are teaching, if they are dictating about democracy and at the same time humanitarian, how on earth a legitimate government is blamed as, parallel to a group that we labeled as a country, Ethiopia? I think the parliament has already declared that that's a terrorist group. And how could they parallelly consider and at the same time demand negotiation?
Okay, so what measures should the government take to communicate the reality on the ground to the international community?
That's a good question. You see, we have to, as Ethiopians, we have to portray the right picture about ourselves. And we have not done the right, we have not struggled to picture, to portray Ethiopia. That's our problem. But they should know, and I'm quite sure that they know. But they are manipulating. They are siding a terrorist group. And the Ethiopian government has to declare, has to, tell the world about Ethiopia. They don't know us in the sense that they, especially the Westerns, especially the politicians, they always portray a wrong picture about this country because they have been...
Specific measures, Dr. Antene, what specific measures do you recommend?
Okay, 1, 2, 3 points. The first point is, as Ethiopians, we all have the responsibility to clearly explain who we are. Because this is a first maintenance strategy. We are like this. We have never been against anyone. And the second point is, the Western countries, whether they have their own intentions or not, they should understand, they should listen to us. We are in the middle of the fight. The fight is about faith. Ethiopia is like this, and we should tell them. And they should listen to us instead of simply, dictating us or manipulating the picture that we have. And the third point is, if they are talking about democracy, if they are talking about freedom, trust, or whatever, it's all about the law. The media law is similar to whether you are poor or rich. And we need to understand, they need to understand the point that there is a law, media law, and at the same time there are a lot of ethical issues. If you take as a point, or as case in point, why the BBC today talk about harvesting. Harvesting is
all right. Dr. Antene Tsegaye, I'll have to cut you short, but thank you very much for your explanation.
Thank you.
And finally, to a story from across West Africa. Gambians began voting on Saturday in the first presidential election in the tiny West African nation since former leader Yahya Jammeh fled into exile. Polls were opened at 8 a.m. with long lines forming well before dawn in the capital Banjul. The voting will be closely watched as a test of the democratic transition in the Gambia, where Jammeh ruled for 22 years after seizing power in a bloodless coup in 1994. President Barrow, 56, is now running for re-election and faces 5 other candidates. Political veteran Ousainu Darboe is considered the leading opposition candidate. The 73-year-old is a lawyer who has represented opponents of Jammeh, who ran for president against the former leader several times. Many voters in the nation of more than 2 million people are hoping for an improvement in their living conditions. You're watching ID's News Hour. A quick reminder of today's headlines. TPLF massacres at least 400 civilians at a single spot in North Ethiopia. It says Ethiopians shall demand integrity and transparency from the State of Department regarding the